Good evening, class. My name is Antonio Carvajal. And so after World War II, you have veterans coming back from the war. This led to a demand in housing. And so in order to accommodate that, city officials redesigned the city and reorganized the city in order to accommodate that. They did this through the process of redlining. Redlining can be described as city officials blocking areas as good and bad. The bad areas are areas where we're densely concentrated by minorities. My proposition is that city layouts cause a disadvantage to minorities. My first point is that there's an economic disadvantage. This can be seen through the way the public schools are funded. So one thing you need to know about the way public schools are funded is that it relies heavily on the property tax. According to the California Public Policy Institute, 52% of their budget comes from property tax. Corey Turner, a specialist in education from NPR, states that the problem with school funding system that relies so heavily on local property tax is straightforward. Property values vary a lot from neighborhood to neighborhood, district to district, and within tax revenues. This means that not all neighborhoods are the same, not all neighborhoods are valued the same, and in return, their tax revenues are not the same, affecting the way the public schools are funded. According to Sean Redrun from Stanford University, this is affecting the performance gap between these two areas of good and bad. The schools in the quote-unquote bad areas lack resources for materials, staffing, and even the maintenance of the buildings. And this can play a big impact on whether a student goes to university or not. And I'm sure you're asking yourself, why don't these people just leave these areas and move out of it? And the truth of the matter is that city officials made it difficult for them to do that. What they did was they denied housing loans. This can be seen. Fidel Ezel Harrison displays this. In Mississippi, 56.8% of black people who applied for housing loans were denied, in comparison to 33.5% of white people. Not only are they denying their ability to buy a house and possibly get a nicer one, but they're denying their opportunity for economic mobility. My second point is that the way cities are designed cause a negative impact on a person's health, on minorities' health, and this can be seen. So due to the lower poverty value, hazardous industries are located in areas with higher concentration of minorities. So because these areas are not valued as highly as other areas, you see a higher concentration of landfills, hazardous waste sites, and other industries in these areas. Jasmine Bell from the Center American Progress states that water contamination plagued low-income areas and communities of color across the nation, and she also states that African Americans had higher exposure rates than whites for 13 out of 14 pollutants. So again, these areas are not valued as high, so you see a higher concentration of hazardous industry, which leads to a higher exposure to pollutants. And so due to this pollution, it's affecting the health. Rachel Massey states that there's an increased rate in cancer associated with exposure to industrial chemicals, and asthma is linked to a variety of environmental factors ranging from car and bus exhaust to certain pesticides. And so, due to the heavy industry located in this area, one is being heavily impacted by the pollutants, which is causing for higher increase of cancer and asthma in these areas, and it's affecting more the children due to their lower immune system. So in summary, the way cities are laid out negatively affects minorities through the economic and environmental components of it.
All right, Antonio, the propositions identified, the phrasing on it's a little bit awkward. The historical background that you're using as your attention device, where you make a reference to redlining and deliberate actions of the city officials, you need some data on that. The closest you come to that is on the economic issue, but it doesn't sound like it's an official policy. It sounds like it's got something to do with the financing that goes on, and there are other issues that might address that point, but I think that that's something that if you're going to make the argument that there is like a deliberate discriminatory process that's going on, you need to have some pretty strong information and not just a couple of statistical correlations that are going on here. There's not really a preview of what the supporting structure is going to be, but you do signpost the major secondary claims, at least the two that I saw in the body of the speech. The subject does sound controversial because it does seem like there is some kind of discriminatory process that's going on, although it feels like it's primarily economic as opposed to related to ethnic animus or something along those lines. And I'm not exactly sure there's quite as much controversy on that when people have limited financial resources and then as a consequence they have lesser choices. I do think that there's probably not much argument that they're going to have less quality schools, or they're going to end up in areas that are probably not as nicely developed or have more industrial sections in them. That's probably not much in doubt on those particular points. And so I think that's why you need to have a little bit more about where the argument is here, and that the argument is that it's a discriminatory process, and that there's a relationship between this that is based on like you said in the statistics that you had on the loans, on some kind of ethnic issue that's going on, like the redlining that you were talking about. In the body of the speech, like I said, the 2 points are reasonably well labeled. You give a little bit of explanation on a couple of the points. I do think that there are some presuppositions that are being made that need a little bit more proof. There are a couple of statistics that you're presenting. You usually have sources for most of the information that you've got. I just feel like the sufficiency of information on all of the points is a little underwhelming. For example, when you talk about the school policies and the performance of the schools, it seems to be assumed that if a school doesn't have as much money that they can't be as good, and I'm not sure that that's demonstrated. The amount of spending per pupil, for instance, might be one of the things that you could document and say, we have higher success rates, more graduation, more college enrollments, something like that with the higher spending per student. But we don't have any data like that. We just have something that talks about how they have fewer resources, and then there's an assumption that because of that's problematic, and I just don't know that that's the case. So there are places that you need to fill in some gaps here to conclude the inference that you're making. You've got some chains that you're presenting, but some of the links in them need more data on them. I think you're a little subdued in the presentation. You can be a little bit more forceful, and you have plenty of time to add some more information into the speech, and I think that it needs it in a few places. All right, thank you.